To African Perspective with me, Aldrin Simpier. On this day that we have a special focus on Nigeria, we move over to this story. The African candidate on the shortlist to assume the position of the Director-General of the World Trade Organization says she will bring a wealth of experience to the job if successful. The WTO is set to reach a consensus later this month that will determine whether Nigeria's Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala will become the first woman and African to hold the position. She's up against South Korea's trade minister, that is Myung-hee, in the final stages of the race. SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease was in conversation with Dr. Okonjo Iweala as the moment of truth draws closer and closer.
Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala, welcome and thank you so much for speaking with us here on SABC News. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Sherwin, for having me.
Firstly, congratulations on being one of two finalists for the WTO's top job. So I guess the best way to start this conversation is, why do you believe you are the best person to lead the World Trade Organization at this time and in this geopolitical context?
Well, thank you. That's a loaded question, but let me begin by saying that the WTO is as important as it's ever been, because trade is very important, as important as it has ever been for the 21st century. And the WTO has the rules that underpins the multilateral trading system. But the WTO is facing a lot of challenges. I'll just mention two or three because they are related to the reason why I think I'm the best candidate. The WTO's dispute settlement system is paralyzed at the moment. And, you know, for a rule-making organization, this undermines the credibility if the very place where the rules can be monitored and people can bring complaints does not work. The WTO has not completed multilateral negotiations for quite some time, but their ongoing fisheries subsidies negotiations, which if brought to a conclusion, could really be a win for the WTO. We are in the midst of COVID-19 at the moment, and the WTO has some rules that could really make trade in medicines, vaccines, and pharmaceuticals much easier, more accessible. You remember many countries have put export restrictions on medical supplies and equipment, and there are some rules about members of the WTO having to notify others, making this export restriction temporary, transparent, and proportionate. Well, if we apply those rules, then, you know, it could help us to open up the trade in medical supplies and equipment. And
we'll get into the nuts and bolts. Let me just take you one step back, Dr. Okonjo Iweala. Why does the WTO matter in the lives of ordinary people who might be watching this discussion? Most people today are perhaps more familiar with the World Health Organization due to the current pandemic. So explain why the WTO matters to ordinary folk and why they should take a keener interest in the machinations that determine some of the successes and the failures you've just been talking about.
Well, the thing is that the WTO is all about trade. And trade affects every single one of us, even down in the rural areas, in the village. We produce things, we sell them to other people. Some of these things are sold on in bulk to people elsewhere, in other countries or even within the same country. So it's all about trade. And trade is one of the means by which we improve our living standards, our economics. So to the ordinary woman and man in the street, if you're talking about trading in goods that you produce or buying other goods, that's what the WTO rules underpin, and that's why it matters to the person on the street that this should work. And I just want to say that the WTO's rules also need to be upgraded to digital economy, the green economy, and it needs new rules to underpin micro, medium, and small enterprises and women in trade. That, again, is something that matters very much to the ordinary person, because in our countries in Africa, there's so many micro, medium, and small enterprises. Many of them are owned by women. And if we can get them to produce more, trade more, and be part of the regional and local supply chains, people's living standards will improve. That's why the WTO matters. Now, as to, you asked me, why am I the most qualified? let me just say a very quick word. I'm a reformer. The WTO needs reforms. My reform credentials are clear. I have strong political skills to be able to bring members together. I have managerial experience from the World Bank. I've been a minister for 7 years, the longest serving finance minister in my country. And I'm also working right now at the intersection of public health and trade. So if you put all this together, I think I'm the candidate for the term.
So, I mean, I'm glad this is a good segue. I'm glad you talked about your credentials. Your challenger, South Korea's Trade Minister, Myung-hee, is also a woman, meaning that the next WTO Director-General will be a woman for the first time in 25 years. Why does that matter in your view? And how will it shape this institution in a different way as opposed to, say, another man?
Well, let's think of it this way. Okay, for more than 70 years, about thereabouts, the GATT, which was the precursor to the WTO, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, has been managed by men. So for the first time in 70 years or so, a woman will be at the helm. If you think about it, that we have talent and intellect distributed equally between men and women, there is absolutely no reason why a woman shouldn't have the ability to run such an organization. And that's why it's anomalous that in all this time, 70 years, it hasn't happened. So I think it's time for a woman to put her implant on there. But that is not the sole reason why a woman should come in. You need a competent person who can solve problems. And if that person happens to be a woman, why not? Sure. And I think we've got two women who have made it to the final. So I think something good is about to happen in that direction.
So you touched a bit on this, right? Being a reformer and an outsider, you are quoted as saying that you bring a clear set of eyes to a dysfunctional organization. Professor Mark L. Bush, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, wrote this in May this year, that the new DG would have to deal with the following problems. You touched on some of these. An appellate body which is not working, a United States that is hostile to the institution, the WTO's ability to handle China is doubted, while COVID-19 has been a boon for protectionists looking to reshore supply chains. What do you say to those specific concerns that he raises?
Well, those concerns are valid, and I raised some of them, as you said earlier. But the key issue is, are there solutions to these concerns? And the answer is yes. It's not going to be easy to solve all those problems of reshoring and supply chains, protectionism, but we can. The issues of the appellate body we refer to, they also have solutions. China and the US are achieving some things together at the WTO, as a matter of fact. People always focus on their differences, but they also have some commonalities. Both of them are around the table in the negotiations on fisheries subsidies. And if that concludes well, it will be a multilateral that the US is there, China is there, the EU, all developing countries are there. And so that's a good thing they can achieve together. Both of them want a functioning dispute resolution system. And so if we're able to do that and restore that system, you have China and the US again around a common success.
So let's talk about that specifically. How do we ensure that this two-tier dispute settlement system is restored? Because at the end of the day, when there's a dispute, it comes down to the WTO appellate division taking a decision in favor of one party or the next. And if it doesn't have the requisite number of members to fulfill that function, it will not be able to operate optimally. So what is the solution there?
The solution is to listen to the desires and complaints of all members. There are many members. I've spoken to over 130 ambassadors and 60 ministers during this competition. And many members would like to keep the two-tier system with the appellate body. But there are some other members who have problems with that, like the United States, and would like to discuss some other options. Developing countries also want a system that works for them. They feel the present system is inaccessible, costly, they can't use it. So we need to listen to all members, put down these different views on the table, and then begin to work towards a common solution. It will be a process. It will take some time. It won't be easy, but we can do it.
As we bear witness to this rising tide of unilateralism, how, in your opinion, can an inclusive, development-orientated, multilateral system be revived? I mean, we have tensions. I'm talking to you from the United Nations in New York. You will well understand that the difficulties that have confronted the multilateral system in the last 4 or 5 years. What's your solution, particularly in the WTO context?
Well, I'm a strong believer in multilateralism and the multilateral trading system. And I think we need to strengthen this because we need global cooperation. There are so many problems in the world that cannot be solved by one country alone. So that is why we need to strengthen. Look at the pandemic, for instance. There is no one country that can solve this pandemic. It needs solidarity, global action, which is why the COVAX facility we developed at the Gavi and WHO works, because it's now a project of solidarity. So multilateral efforts are important. And that's why I think we should strengthen the multilateral trading system. That is why WTO matters, because it assures predictability, stability, and fairness in this system.
Many analysts are talking about how COVID-19 has really provided the possibility for a developmental revolution in the world, given the slow progress we have made in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and, of course, the 2030 deadline looming large. What role does the WTO have in everybody achieving the SDGs by that given deadline?
You know, it's so interesting, Sherwin, that the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement, which set up the WTO, talks about WTO's purpose as being to improve living standards, increase incomes and employment, and support sustainable development. So actually, the purpose of the WTO is partly to support sustainable development, and it can. The WTO right now is involved in the fisheries subsidies negotiations for the sustainability of our oceans and biodiversity of our fish stocks. And that is speaking directly to SDG 14. So the WTO is about trade, and trade is one of the instruments of development to improve the living standards of people. So the WTO is very relevant in delivering on the SDGs.
So the African Union finally providing its official backing to your candidacy late last week. What did you make in terms of that sort of delay? I know there were other African candidates in the mix. What's your relationship like with various African countries that make up the African Union?
My relationship is excellent. As you know, I'm African Union envoy at the moment for mobilizing resources for COVID-19. I'm one of 7 envoys, so it's excellent. Look, let me put it this way. People often say that Africa doesn't have the talent to compete in these international competitions. What has happened is that the continent produced 3 qualified people, and we competed. So my attitude to that has been, I'm really proud of that. We've shown that we have the people, and at the end of the day, one of the 3, which is me, it has lasted till the end. And so the African Union has come behind me, and I think we should just look at that solidarity now, which is what matters. African ambassadors at the WTO are campaigning on my behalf as we speak.
The African Continental Free Trade Area was due to commence in July, but of course COVID-19 has shifted timelines for almost everything in the world. What do you make of this initiative and in terms of how it will inform your function as a future possible, the next DG of the WTO?
I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area, the agreement is an excellent one for the continent. It will create the largest market in the world. And if we solve our problems of logistics and movement within the continent, this will be a wonderful thing because it means we'll have a large internal market. And we need to make full use of this. We need to produce more. We need to add value to our products. We need to industrialize along the lines of Agenda 2063, which the continent has signed on to. So when we produce more goods, when we trade more with each other, intra-African trade is only 15%. Now we should increase that. And world trade has fallen from 5 to 3%, Africa's share of world trade. So we need this production, this industrialization to increase our capacity to trade. And at WTO, there are instruments that can help strengthen and support the African Continental Free Trade Area. There's something called Aid for Trade, which can help us strengthen the Secretariat and making sure that the WTO and AFT, CFTA are compatible will be very helpful in shoring up our ability to trade with the world.
Dr. Okonjo Iweala, you'll also be aware of how difficult it was to reach that agreement in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. One of the outliers, for example, was your own country, Nigeria, that took a long time in joining this accord. You touched on some of the obstacles. Is Africa unified enough in terms of keeping this thing functional and together, given the benefits that it possesses for the continent?
I think so, and I'm very proud of Africa. And what has been done with this agreement. I'm actually also proud of the way the continent has responded in a unified way to COVID-19, by the way. For the free trade area, I think we are capable of making this work. And we need to make it work. We need to create jobs and employment for our young people. We need to manufacture more on the continent. We have raw materials. We cannot continue exporting raw materials forever. We need to add value to this. So yes, we need to make it work because it's absolutely necessary. There's nowhere to go. And by industrializing more, creating better jobs for our young people, taking away the barriers that keep us from trading with each other, be it stops at the border. Sometimes you see lorries lined up, for miles, trying to enter from one country to the other. Once we remove those kinds of barriers and make it easier, I think we'll have a workable thing. The other thing is the digital revolution. We begin to digitize trade. We have electronic commerce now. More and more is being done digitally. So Africa's trade also needs to be digitized, and this is quite an exciting prospect.
So let's talk a bit about kind of what happens until we reach a decision by the end of this month. What's your day-to-day like? I mean, you talked about African ambassadors that are lobbying on your behalf. Are there European ambassadors? What are the Americans doing? Just tell us about what you do on a day-to-day basis in terms of winning this race.
Wow, this has been quite a grueling and challenging time, but I'm always up to a challenge. And I'm very grateful to my country for the backing, to my president, to all the Africans who are now campaigning. My day-to-day is from morning till night. I'm either in interviews with ministers of trade and ministers of foreign affairs in different countries. I've interviewed with over 60 as I speak. I'm also interviewing with ambassadors in Geneva. I've interviewed with over 130 of the 164 one-on-one. So this is a grueling task. I'm addressing groups, negotiating groups within the WTO, like the Latin America group called GRULAG, the ASEAN, different groups, the least developed countries. So it's a daily from morning till night is work. But we'll get there. We'll get there.
So let me ask you a final question, right? We've talked about the challenges, why you believe you're the best person for this position. What's the first thing you would do, in terms of the first 90 days or the first 100 days? That's kind of how we frame these debates in terms of races like this. What's the most pressing issue that you want to be able to check off your list?
I talk about the first 180 days in my case.
Okay, I'll give you an extra 80.
Sherwin, the first and foremost thing is the organization of the next ministerial, the MC12. This is where the trade ministers make the key decisions. So preparing that ministerial will be key. And there's not much time. It's supposed to take place mid-2021. So trying to find 2 or 3 items that members can agree on, that will be wins. The WTO needs some wins. It needs to show the world that the WTO is back and can get results. So that's what I'll focus on. 1, trying to get the fisheries subsidies negotiations completed even before the ministerial, so that there can be a celebration of it there. We can focus on implementation at that time. Working on the health and trade initiatives so that we can find longer-term solutions to COVID-19. This will not be the only pandemic. Looking at how to work on digital e-commerce negotiations, because this is vital. I'd like to take an agenda on women and trade, micro, medium, and small enterprises, and above all, the dispute settlement system, focusing on the process for resolving that and bringing it back to life.
So do you think you've got this? You got it in the bag?
I'm very optimistic. Nothing is ever in the bag till it's in the bag.
Right.
So I cannot say that, but the wind is behind my back.
Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala, thank you so much for speaking with us here on SABC News. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, Sherwin, for having me.
Dr. Ngozi Okonjo Iweala is an economist. She's the current chair of the board of the Gavi Vaccine Alliance. She's a former minister, both foreign and finance in Nigeria, a former managing director at the World Bank, one of the two remaining candidates to be the next Director General of the World Trade Organization, and could become the first African and woman to achieve that feat.